Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the day's big issues that we need to look at in depth. Nothing is off the table and no one will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is political commentator and writer Benedict Spence, and here's what we've got coming up on the show. Boris Johnson's second ethics chief has resigned following Partygate. We'll get the latest from Westminster. Plus, with train services about to go off the rails in a series of strikes, how do we get journeys back on track? And do we really want to quit the European Convention of Human Rights over meddling in the Rwanda plan? It's a hot topic, so it's high time we really lifted the lid on that debate. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you want to talk about? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet me at gbnews. First, though, it's time for GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The government has published the resignation letter from Boris Johnson's former ethics advisor and the Prime Minister's response. In the letter, Lord Geidt, who left his position suddenly yesterday, says, "I was tasked to offer a view about the government's intention to consider measures which risk a deliberate and purposeful breach of the ministerial code. This request has placed me in an impossible and odious position." The idea that a Prime Minister might to any degree be in the business of deliberately breaching his own code is an affront. "I can have no part in this." In a response letter, Boris Johnson called the resignation a surprise and said he'd been seeking Lord Geidt's advice in the national interest in protecting a crucial industry. He's the second ethics advisor to resign under the Prime Minister in 3 years. The Bank of England has increased interest rates from 1% to 1.25% as the cost of living continues to soar. It's the fifth consecutive rise, pushing them to the highest level in 13 years. The bank warned prices for households may increase even further than expected. It said the Consumer Prices Index, a measure of inflation, could reach above 11% in October. Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey can return to the US after being granted unconditional bail over charges of sexually assaulting 3 men. The 62-year-old faced 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. His lawyer told Westminster Magistrates Court his client strenuously denies all and any criminality. Mr. Spacey will next appear at Southwark Crown Court on the 14th of July. The Transport Secretary says next week's rail strikes are an incredible act of self-harm. Grant Shapps says they're designed to inflict damage at the worst possible time, and he says they're an attempt to derail critical reforms. RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch says union members are striving for a deal that protects their jobs and gives them a pay rise. Tenants will be given more powers to challenge poor practices and unjustified rent increases by their landlords as part of the government's new deal for private renters in England. The publication of a new government white paper later will also end blanket bans on families with children and those on benefits. The measures will form part of the Renters Reform Bill. It aims to redress the balance between landlords and privately renting households across England. Freddie Poser, director of Priced Out, says there needs to be more building of homes across the country.
It doesn't really matter if we're building social homes or market rate homes. We need to build all of these sorts of homes, and the government needs to stop sort of applying sticking plaster after sticking plaster and actually tackle the root of this problem, which is supply.
Specialist rape courts are being set up as part of a trial in England to try and improve conviction rates for sexual offences. The government says court staff and police will receive specialist training. Advisors will also be on hand for victims. The pilot scheme will be rolled out in Leeds, Newcastle and Snaresbrook Crown's Court, each with a dedicated courtroom for dealing with the rape cases. The Prime Minister's official spokesman says continued crossing of the English Channel in small boats has showed the need for the Rwanda policy. It says the Ministry of Defence confirmed 233 people reached the coast of Kent on half a dozen small boats yesterday. A GB News producer has said at least 80 people have been picked up in 2 small boats today. And archaeologists working on an HS2 site have discovered a burial ground containing nearly 140 graves. The site in Wendover, Buckinghamshire, is one of the largest Anglo-Saxon burial grounds ever uncovered in Britain. One skeleton was found with an iron object embedded in its spine, which experts believe may have contributed to their death. Items from the 5th and 6th centuries were also found, including brooches, amber beads and knives. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to We Need to Talk About with Alex.
In the court of King Boris, many have had itchy feet, especially those not given shiny jobs in the cabinet, but charged with pulling the levers behind the scenes inside the heart of Number 10. Today, the Prime Minister's ethics advisor, Lord Geidt, has resigned without notice, making him the second to give up on a role that is increasingly challenging under a leader regularly under fire for bending rules. It was a known fact that Geidt had suggested there was due concern over whether Boris broke the ministerial code with his breaches under the Partygate scandal. But it now transpires another event is calling into question the Prime Minister's behaviour and has been raised to his hand-picked standard czar, seemingly making his job rather untenable. And now Lord Geidt's resignation letter has been published. Our political correspondent Tom Harwood is live at Westminster with the details. Tom, tell us more.
Yes, it's quite an extraordinary development, really. In one sense, this was to some extent expected. Lord Geidt had been threatening to resign for quite some time, whether it was over Downing Street curtains or Partygate. But the reason that Lord Geidt set out in his letter has raised quite a few eyebrows. It's over a request from the Prime Minister for Lord Geidt to adjudicate over a pretty complicated settlement of a trade dispute, of whether or not to protect a critical national industry and whether or not the government's proposals to protect this industry would be in contravention of World Trade Organization rules, and whether by being in contravention of those rules it would indeed breach the ministerial code. That's what was asked of Lord Geidt, and he felt like that was the straw that broke the camel's back, something that went too far. A lot of people are slightly confused about this because, of course, Boris Johnson wasn't saying that what he will do will breach international law. He was asking whether it would, and it does seem to many people like Lord Geidt was sort of scrambling for an excuse to resign. Just a couple of days ago, he sat before the PACAC committee, the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, and faced a pretty tough grilling from members of Parliament, Tory and Labour, and indeed other parties as well on that committee. And many people are suggesting that actually it was that committee appearance where he was sort of questioned in terms of what his role was for and how he was acting within it. That may well be what pushed him over the edge. He wrote his letter to Boris Johnson yesterday evening. Boris Johnson replied this morning to that letter, and we got it just before midday, the whole lot published on the government website. So we have been able to now see this exchange of letters detailing a pretty intricate dispute over protecting a critical national industry. It's something that they can't go into in a great amount of detail because of the sensitive commercial aspects of this policy, and it is not yet public knowledge. However, we do understand that it has something to do with the British steel industry and potentially Chinese steel imports. Now, that doesn't seem like the biggest deal in the world for someone to resign over, and many people are suggesting that Lord Geidt may well be using it as an excuse for a greater set of discontent.
I mean, breaking international law has been a hot topic recently with the planned upheaval of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But it's my understanding that actually the Ministerial Code of Conduct was stripped of the tracts relating to international law a number of years back.
Yes, it's interesting. What the Prime Minister was asking of Lord Geidt was not how do we get through this obvious breach of the Ministerial Code, but was actually asking clarification on whether or not his proposal would breach the Ministerial Code. When I and a number of other journalists asked the Prime Minister's spokesman about this very issue just an hour ago, the Prime Minister's spokesman said he couldn't opine on what the Ministerial Code says or not. That is why they asked Lord Geidt. That's what Lord Geidt was there for. And Number 10 was hoping that Lord Geidt would provide clarity on this very issue because Number 10 was not sure. Now, it's slightly curious as to why that was the resigning matter. However, clearly looking in a wider context, there is more going on here than a specific policy about protecting a steel industry. This is clearly to do with the wider malaise in the government, the repeated threats of Lord Geidt to resign over some time. But looking at the political context of what has gone on, I think there is a tendency to perhaps read too much into what is going on right now. Of course, it was only 2 weeks ago that MPs, Conservative MPs, voted confidence in Boris Johnson. A large number, 40% of them, voting no confidence. But to some extent, their concerns with ethics and indeed their concerns with the likely loss of 2 by-elections this time next week, that was to some extent already baked in to how people voted in that confidence vote. I'm not getting the sense today here in Westminster that this is changing many MPs' minds.
Tom, thank you ever so much. Tom Harwood there, political correspondent. Benedict, I mean, it does seem that working in Number 10 isn't a particularly attractive position at the moment. This is the second ethics advisor to quit. Is he going to be able to get a new one?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be somebody. There's always somebody who's prepared to be an ethics advisor, of all things. It is odd, isn't it? Especially as Tom was sort of touching upon just there. Lord Geidt was sort of prepared to sit through the many travails of Partygate, but an issue over steel subsidies, of which we're not entirely party to, though that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And Number 10 coming out and saying, well, actually, we weren't actually breaking the Ministerial Code or anything. We were actually asking him for his opinion. It is an odd sort of series of events, and I do think that Tom is on something there. It almost feels like this is just somebody who was sort of searching for the exit, possibly lost his opportunity earlier on, perhaps was hoping that MPs, the Tory backbench MPs would vote no confidence in the Prime Minister and therefore wouldn't have to resign. So, yeah, it's an odd one. Just sort of as an aside, slightly unrelated, I do think it's very interesting that, again, that this is over a potential change or breach of international law, international rules. Of course, we've already had, in the last couple of weeks, we've had talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol and obviously the whole issue with the deportations of people to Rwanda for processing and whether or not these things contravene international treaties, international law. And it does seem to me that this is going to be something that's going to keep on coming back for Boris Johnson government, and it might actually be something that he quite enjoys, quite relishes, is the idea that his government will be taking on more international laws, more sort of rules-based institutions. This could play very well for him electorally. So to have an ethics advisor resign, on the one hand, not very good to have your ethics advisor resign, but if it's over an issue of international law, amid this sort of broader context, not necessarily the worst thing in the world.
Benedict, thank you. We'll, of course, be discussing the ECHR and whether we should stay in it. Now, for the country that invented railways and, well, built an empire on exporting that technology around the world, is now constantly crippled by it. Spend even a few weeks in another country and taking a train feels like an express to utopia compared to Britain's overcrowded, unreliable, miserable system that croaks along between grubby concrete stations like the trains themselves can't even be bothered turning up to work. Well, now, a series of strikes is set to add even more frustration to a system that has gone off the rails. Ever been on those lovely French trains that zip through the landscape with swaying buffet carriages packed with wine and charcuterie-stuffed baguettes? Yeah, here you're lucky if you even get a seat and don't have to sit on the floor by the bog sipping a granular instant coffee, threatening to be squashed at a moment's notice by a teetering Jenga stack of luggage as people point angry fingers in each other's faces over seat reservations. And yet at the front, acres of doily-clad empty seats for £100,000 a pop stay vacant. Basically, it all seemed to go to pot when the railways were nationalised. It's not like there's competition well, not when they're nationalised, when they're privatised. Not like there's competition when companies have secured entire regional monopolies, is there, and only wanted to boost their profits. Well, it's surely time Brexit Britain stuck two fingers up at EU competition law preventing us nationalising them and took back control to get the entire system back on track. Well, joining me now is GB News reporter Paul Hawkins, who's live at Paddington Station in London. Paul, what's the latest on these strikes? I mean, it's going to cause travel chaos.
Yeah, huge chaos. One of the biggest strikes for decades, really, across the country's network. 3 days next week, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. But on the days when the strikes don't operate, there will still be significant disruption. So on the days the strikes do operate, you're looking at 20% of services across the UK. On the days that they don't, that'll increase to 60%, but still you're looking at limited service, nothing north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, nothing heading towards Cornwall. So this is going to cause a lot of disruption for millions of people. They reckon the economy will be hit by £150 million. Today we heard from Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary. This is the first time he's spoken at length about the strikes. Very combative, talking directly to rail workers. He looked down the camera and he described union leaders as militants, said that rail workers need to ignore that going ahead with these strikes will further alienate passengers who have not been taking the train as much, obviously during the pandemic and even since, with a lot of people working from home, although Grant Shapps saying that could be a strength next week and that the unions can't hold the country, and I paraphrase, can't hold the country to ransom because a lot of people can have Zoom meetings and take use of technology now and don't have to necessarily go into the office. But he appealed directly to rail workers not to go ahead with the industrial action next week, and this is what he had to say.
Appeal directly to rail workers, who I think are less militant than their union leaders. Don't risk striking. Don't risk the industry and your future. Don't risk striking yourself out of a job. Don't pitch yourself against the public. Let's fix this station and get back to building a better railway.
Yesterday, the RMT, the main rail union that are bringing about this industrial action, they wrote to the Transport Secretary saying, look, can we have a meeting with the government, please, face to face, let's talk this through, because effectively you're putting the strings in the background. Network Rail is a state-run company, let's have a face-to-face meeting. He was asked twice by that today, including by myself, why he wouldn't have a face-to-face meeting with the RMT. He said it was because he didn't want to undermine Network Rail and the rail franchises, that the structure in place meant they were the bosses, they were the people who set the pay and terms and conditions, and so they were the ones who need to carry out the talks. Responding to what Grant Shapps has said today, and by the way, he also said that the government will be looking at options to legislate so it was harder for rail workers to strike in the future. But the RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch has said the threats made by Grant Shapps today to railway workers' livelihoods and their right to strike are disgraceful. They'll make RMT members even more fiercely determined to win this dispute. Instead of playing to the gallery for his own personal political ambitions, Grant Shapps needs to act like a pragmatic Transport Secretary who is willing to meet with the union and help us reach a negotiated settlement. It is clear now the governments are intent on making this industrial dispute over pay and jobs into a political fight with the RMT. There's going to be a lot of disruption next week, but the government is gambling that with the new ways of working that a lot of people have now, working from home, meetings via Zoom, etc., that the disruption won't be too great and that they'll be able to see this through. For the unions, they've gone straight for the nuclear option. Difficult to see where they go after this, other than just announcing another week of strikes.
Paul, thank you ever so much. Paul Hawkins there, our national correspondent. Benedict, I mean, you know, it's like the 1970s are on the phone. They want their economy back and the industrial action. And, I mean, you know, Paul has a point there, doesn't he, that this is becoming a political fight. And bearing in mind what you were saying earlier about going up against the global rules-based order, I mean, is this a government almost profiting politically from industrial action, which is to be expected in the current economic climate?
I mean, it's certainly, I think it'll focus minds on the backbenchers. I mean, you know, there was a lot of talk after the vote of confidence in Boris Johnson, but, well, he's going to be toast because there's going to be lots of rebellions. His MPs will, you know, they won't vote with the government on lots of things. There'll be constant sniping. But the problem is, as we're seeing, there are lots of things that are happening right now that I think are actually, they're probably going to force the Tory party, or sensible members of the Tory party anyway, to unify around the Prime Minister, as much as they don't necessarily like him, because, as you point out, the alternative is the government being dragged down and not necessarily into a position where they can rectify it. I mean, things like industrial action do give Boris Johnson a central rallying point, but I think the difficult thing actually for a lot of rail workers is we often get it into our minds, don't we, that train drivers are very well paid. They are. But actually, most rail workers, sort of at large, aren't. I think they get pretty much bang on the average salary, £30,000 a year, which, given that we're in a cost of living crisis, given that most of them haven't had a pay rise in about 4 or 5 years, doesn't really put them in a very good position. And I think a lot of people will look at their their situation in the round and say, there is some sympathy, actually, for the railway workers. And if they have, this capacity to cripple the country to try to get a better standard of living for themselves, I think a lot of people, whilst it'll irritate them, I also think a lot of people will go, well, things aren't great at the moment, why shouldn't they? Good for them. I think there's also the reality, which is that in most countries, railways are not privatised in the way that they are in this country. Why? Because they're natural monopolies. And even conservatives, even free market conservatives, ought to be able to see this is not a fair system, and a lot of money gets taken out of the system through shares and dividends. Really, this is something that governments haven't come to terms with because that's not something that they want to touch. But they're going to have to at some point. Otherwise, we're going to end up continuously in this position until we get automation, which in this country could be 30 or 40 years away.
Yeah, good points, Benedict. It is indeed true, isn't it? And now we're out of the EU, we could indeed renationalise our railways, something we wouldn't have been able to do under EU competition regulation. Perhaps it's a good idea. What do you think? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Will you be affected by those strikes? Or has working from home become such a regular thing now that it probably won't even affect you? Just gives you a bit of time off to enjoy the sunshine. You can also tweet us at GB News. You're with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, do we really want to quit the European Convention on Human Rights? We'll be discussing that after the break. But first, here's the weather forecast.
Hello, it's going to turn fine and dry across the bulk of the UK in the next couple of days. There will be some rain in the northwest through Thursday, but elsewhere it'll be fine, dry and turning increasingly hot and humid. If we look at the pressure pattern then through the rest of Thursday, then you can see high pressure very much dominating across the UK. And so we head into Thursday into Friday, we start to drag in a more southerly airflow, and that's really going to lift those temperatures. So I think Friday will be the peak of the heat, where we could see temperatures in the low to locally mid-30s. Back to Thursday afternoon then, you can see some rain towards the north and the west affecting Scotland and Northern Ireland, some showery outbreaks of rain affecting Aberdeenshire. But elsewhere across the bulk of England, Wales, Northern England as well, it'll be fine and dry. Variable amounts of cloud at times in the west, but still plenty of sunshine to come. And in that southeast corner, look at these temperatures. We could see highs of 29 or 30 degrees. That would make it the warmest day of the year so far. Still cooler though towards the north and the west. As we head through the rest of Thursday into the evening and overnight then, you can see heavy, more persistent rain spreading in across Scotland and Northern Ireland. So turning quite wet here, some strong winds developing as well. But elsewhere across the bulk of England and Wales, it'll be another dry night, variable amounts of cloud and a warm and muggy night to come, particularly in the south where we can see lows just falling to 19 or 20 degrees, a little bit cooler further towards the north. As we look into Friday then, you can see that heavy rain still affecting much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, continuing for much of the day, slowly pushing its way southwards as we head through the day. But elsewhere across England and Wales, look at this, fine, dry, plenty of sunshine, and with those southerly winds that I mentioned, temperatures really will lift. So probably the peak of the heat, like I said, we could see widely temperatures across England and Wales into the low 30s, but in the southeast corner, 33 or 34 degrees, quite exceptional for the time of the year. Once again, cooler across Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we head through the rest of Friday into the evening and overnight. That cold front will slowly sink its way southwards, affecting Northern England, Northern Wales by the end of the night. To the north of it, it will be cooler and fresher, but again, another warm, muggy night across England and Wales. Quite uncomfortable for sleeping, I think. Gradually, it will turn more unsettled as we head into the weekend. We will see a thundery breakdown across much of England and Wales. That will clear and it will turn fresher for all.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents. Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Oh, those meddling judges in Strasbourg have done it again. They've intervened at the 11th hour to prevent the migrant flights from Britain taking off for Rwanda. The Human Rights Convention, created in part by Churchill no less, is increasingly used for malign reasons, to espouse the rights of terrorists and aggressors at the expense of innocent victims, and allowing a faceless, unelected elite to steamroll over a democratic domestic agenda. It's no longer fit for purpose, people say. And what did it ever do to stop atrocities in Bosnia and now Ukraine? Well, hold your horses, others would argue. Britain also often priding itself on being the vanguard when it comes to defending what must be protected, standing up to oppressors and leading from the front when change is long overdue. If we hold our head high over our role in NATO and insist Brexit Britain can be a force for global good, reversing its high speed out of an international concord on rights surely sets a precedent that goes against the UK championing itself as a leader and standard setter. Remain and reform. An argument that is all too familiar, isn't it? And it didn't work before. We know how hard it is for these supranational blobs to change. Well, let's talk to Chief Political Writer at Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, I mean, I find this a very complex debate because it is so nuanced, and I'm a bit agnostic on it. I don't know which side of the fence I come down on. Give me your take on it.
Yeah, I think we should leave the ECHR. I don't think it's a real rights body at all in any meaningful sense. And I don't like the idea of human rights full stop. And I say that as someone who believes very strongly in political rights and freedom. But the problem with human rights is that they often restrict our freedom. So if you look at the European Court's definition of freedom of speech, for example, the Convention says we all have freedom of speech, except in the following circumstances where it may be curtailed and smashed and you could be arrested. So it gives us freedom of speech, but then takes it away in the same breath. And that really sums up human rights law. And I think it's about time we had a very serious public discussion about whether we want to be in this court and whether we want to have the Human Rights Act.
There would be those who said that, given when it was established and the sort of things happening back in that particular period of history, it was necessary to have a body above the national level to potentially protect people if a malign leader took control. Is it not the fact that looking at the way Britain is performing now and really sort of leading from the front when it comes to Ukraine, that we might be better off trying to change the thing for better if it is not fit for purpose and outdated?
I think we have a very proud tradition in this country of fighting for freedom, particularly press freedom, political freedom, the right to vote. There is a long, centuries-long history of us fighting for those rights. I don't think we need these new so-called human rights to bolster what we've already fought for ourselves. And in fact, as I was saying, human rights sometimes get in the way of the freedoms that we fought for ourselves. So there's a real problem there. But I think the idea of having anything that is above the national level or above democracy, that always worries me because it means that it is out of our reach. It means there's nothing we can do about it. So if the European Court of Human Rights were suddenly to decree that men who believe they are women have the right to go into any situation they want to or any room that they want to, then what could we do about that? That shouldn't be above the national level because we would want to have a discussion. We would want to decide that for ourselves. So I think bringing everything back to the democratic sphere, including the question of rights and freedom, is always a good idea.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you say there, but other people might say we might not need them. If we have a British Bill of Rights, it could actually go further than the ECHR and put in place protections that currently are under threat, protections for victims, for example. But they might say that we might not need them, but citizens in other countries may well need that kind of protection. And Britain leaving would set a dangerous precedent for countries that could end up going down a particularly nasty route.
But I think the problem there is that even in European countries where there is obviously repression and a lack of freedom, and we know those countries exist, the problem even in those situations when activists appeal to the European Court of Human Rights is that they're constantly being drawn away from having that discussion with their own people, setting up movements, getting masses of people behind them in order to overthrow the oppressive structures or the oppressive laws. So the court has a warping effect even when it comes to people who are demanding their rights, because it constantly draws them to this supranational level rather than encouraging a democratic struggle for freedom. So across the board, I think it has a problematic impact on democracy, first off, as we've seen this week in the UK, and even on the question of freedom. And the sooner we have a discussion and potentially a referendum on this institution, then I think we can really throw open all aspects of this conversation.
Brendan O'Neill, fascinating hearing your thoughts. Well, really briefly, Benedict, because we were chasing the clock at the moment, very quickly, should we leave or should we not?
I don't think that it necessarily serves us well to stay, given that it's only... fundamentally, you need to look at this as it's being supported by people who I think don't have a lot of trust in their own fellow citizens to do the right thing. I think that our desire to sort of cling on to this it is born through an idea that if it is just left up to the British people will make the so-called wrong decision. And I think that that is a very sad state of affairs. And I mean, as Brendan just pointed out there, you know, as you said, there might be a precedent set if Britain leaves, other countries might do the same. Let's be honest. Countries that plan on abusing their own citizens, they do it whatever an international court says, be it in Europe, be it anywhere else. And so I don't necessarily think that Britain leaving would set that bad a precedent. Ultimately, this is about sovereignty. You cannot be sovereign as a state if there is any other body, be it the United Nations, be it the EU, be it a court, that says, actually, no, we're going to overrule what your citizens want.
Powerful arguments there, Benedict. Thank you very much. And I want to know your thoughts on that. I think a lot of you probably support what both Brendan and Benedict have said. But if you disagree with them, do let me know. Should we be staying in the ECHR? You can email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet me at gbnews. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. Coming up, private landlords will be prevented from evicting tenants in England without giving a reason, under proposals published by the government today. That's just one of many new proposals. But what the landlords and tenants think about them. Find out after the break. Now, though, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 2:33. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson's former ethics advisor says he's quit after being placed in an impossible and odious position over a plan to risk breaking the ministerial code. In his resignation letter published earlier, Lord Geidt, who left his position suddenly yesterday, described it as an affront, saying he could have no part in it. Downing Street has said that Boris Johnson's reportedly considering whether or not to replace Lord Geidt, as he refused the role. The Bank of England has increased interest rates from 1.1% to 1.25% as the cost of living continues to soar. It's the fifth consecutive rise, pushing them to the highest level in 13 years. Inflation is currently at a 40-year high of 9%, and the bank's warned it could surpass 11% in October. Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey can return to the US. That's after being granted unconditional bail over charges of sexually assaulting 3 men. The 62-year-old faced 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. His lawyer told Westminster Magistrates Court his client strenuously denies all and any criminality. The Transport Secretary says next week's rail strikes are an incredible act of self-harm. Grant Shapps says they're designed to inflict damage at the worst possible time, and he says they're an attempt to derail critical reforms. Unions have described the national rail strikes over pay, jobs and conditions as the biggest in history. The Prime Minister's spokesperson says continued crossings of the English Channel and small boats show the need for the government's Rwanda policy. As the Ministry of Defence confirmed, 233 people reached the coast of Kent on half a dozen small boats yesterday. GBNews understands at least 80 people have been picked up in 2 small boats today. TV Online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Is back to We Need to Talk About with Alex in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents. Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to We Need to Talk About. This is GB News and I'm Alex Phillips. Having rented abroad and now in the UK, it's strange that we have a system that unapologetically tips heavily in favour of the landlord. British renters have been able to be forced out without notice. Those at the bottom end snobbily blocked from getting accommodation, while landlords can make demands that not even a lick of paint touches a wall while doing nothing about the mildew and raking in a nice monthly income. Well, today, property owners can no longer boot people out of their homes and have to have good reason to block them from keeping pets too. But is this new legislation going to do anything to address a housing crisis that continues to widen generational wealth gaps with each passing year? Or is it the bare minimum to prevent people becoming homeless while making a dog's dinner of everything else? Well, joining us now is the head of public affairs at the homeless charity shelter, Alistair Harper. Alistair, I mean, for a lot of people out there, you'd think, why does this legislation not already exist that prevents people from being kicked out of their homes? I mean, when people are renting, it's still their home.
It's bonkers, isn't it? We've inherited a system where we've let the private rented sector get completely out of control. It's doubled in the last decade alone. It's become something so utterly different to what it was designed to be. Back when we brought in the reforms in the 1980s that enabled it to be easy to be a private landlord. Back then, we were inventing a system, a private rented system that was designed for people who weren't ready to set down their roots. They wanted to be flexible. They wanted to pay a little rent before they decided what their life would be. Right now, landlords are deciding what people's lives will be. Landlords are deciding how their tenants are going to live, and landlords are the ones getting the benefit as their mortgages are paid off the sweat of the backs of countless families across this country, the 11 million people in this country stuck in the private rented sector. So hopefully the rules are going to catch up with the reality of the system, a system we need to shrink.
Yeah, I mean, do you think these reforms go far enough, given that it's increasingly difficult for people to get on the housing ladder and some people are trapped in renting for decades? You know, if you have children in rented accommodation, you might want to paint a bedroom a nice colour and change things around a bit to accommodate a baby, put out some blackout blinds, whatever. And yet, when you rent, you kind of live in that place a bit like a hostage.
You're treated as if you should be terribly grateful that you're spending thousands of pounds for someone else to have a nice life. I think it's absolutely a mess. You're right, it's not enough. This gets us to fixing some of the rules that have made it absolutely out of balance, that landlords could, for no reason, just evict people. And in reality, that meant if you complain that there's damp, if you complain the boiler doesn't work, your landlord could just say, well, that sounds a bit of work. Here's a Section 21 notice and off you hop. All right, so fixing that is great, that's progress, but we shouldn't have this system. We shouldn't be so reliant on the private rented sector. We should have more easy routes to ownership. We should have more easy routes to genuinely affordable social housing in this country, which can be the springboard of opportunity for people. It used to be the springboard of opportunity for people. Instead, too often now, people are struggling each week, each month, just to pay for the mortgage to someone else. And half of tenants have no savings whatsoever. Just under half of tenants have no savings whatsoever. So they're not on the edge of ownership, they're on the edge of homelessness. So we need to take the system in hand across the board.
I mean, people would say you've got to draw the line somewhere, though, and landlords might say there's so much regulation they have to follow now. And also, if you're someone who's gone to work abroad for 5 years, own a home and want to let it out, you might not want someone moving in with 5 Alsatians, a bunny rabbit, a goldfish and a tank of tarantulas.
If Ace Ventura Pet Detective did want to move in, I'm sure that we could find a way to accommodate them. The thing is, being a landlord's a job, but it's treated as if it's an act of kindness. The best landlords know it's a job, the best landlords follow the rules, but unfortunately the reputation for their sector is absolutely in the gutter, and it's because of the bad guys. And unfortunately right now in law, the bad guys are within the law when they abuse their tenants. This makes a level playing field for the good guys, and they should be excited for that.
Now, Benedict, one thing that occurs to me now, we've got a cost of living crisis, rising interest rates, rising inflation. Yes, rising interest rates will see people paying a little bit more of their mortgages, but probably not to the same tune as people are suffering when it comes to the pound in their pocket. I've noticed that a few people I know who rent properties, all of a sudden the valuations officer's coming round, isn't it? It's probably time to put your rent up. Do you think we need things like rent control as well?
I don't know about rent controls, but I do think that we need to be a lot more militant about just the concept of private rented accommodation in this country. I think that this is something that the Conservative Party has fundamentally misunderstood, because it understands that people who are, landlords, they often tend to vote Conservative. What it hasn't quite worked out is that this is locking out a generation of people who once upon a time would have been future Conservative voters because they'd have become, I hate that word, but it is accurate, stakeholders in society because they own their own property. But the Conservative Party has decided to get rid of that promising future to secure itself in the now. What you're doing is you're creating a lot of people who don't have that same sort of stake in society, who therefore won't have the same political outlook, in my opinion, will vote increasingly leftwards. And I think that the Conservative Party is setting itself up for a catastrophic failing in the next 10 to 20 years, when you do have millions of people who can't afford their own homes and therefore are putting off starting families, and who are relying ultimately on wealthy relatives to die before they can actually get themselves going in society. I think that's a disastrous state of affairs. Really, I think we need to be a lot more radical about how we do this. I think that it needs to be the policy of the Conservative Party to get roofs over the heads of people on their own terms that they can own, rather than it just be making sure that landlords get their rent on time, and that actually, that they can be a little bit nicer to their tenants, but ultimately that we're still protecting those people. I think there need to be bans on the number of houses that landlords can buy. I think there need to be bans on foreign speculators buying properties, especially in London, just because the value is going to go up. I think there need to be taxes on people who sell properties to people in order for them to become landlords. I also think there should be tax breaks on people who want to sell their second, third, fourth properties to first-time buyers. I think we need to be a lot more aggressive about this, and I'm sure that this will horrify a lot of conservatives, a lot of free marketers, and a lot of landlords. But ultimately, I'm talking decades here. I'm looking at long-term, if you like, so the future of our nation and what we consider to be centrist politics rather than left-wing politics. That's the disaster that I see unfolding, and I don't see any other way around it other than quite aggressive interventionist policies.
Guys, you've been fascinating to talk to on this. Agree with everything you've both said. If only you could go and advise the government, because they're not going far enough, are they? Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Benedict. Lots of you have been getting in touch with your views during the programme. Keep them coming in. Trevor says, we really must leave the European Court of Human Rights, as the UK doesn't need a body over and above our own laws. Tim says, bottom-up, organically grown systems of law like our common law are always best. Top-down systems like the ECHR never work well, as they are theoretical, imposed from above and not tested against reality. On landlords, Elizabeth says, why do you always assume that all private landlords are ogres? They are not. My parents are private landlords and keep their properties in excellent condition, as well as reducing the rent for their tenants so that he could keep the property. Not everyone out there is a bad, and that's true, but believe me, when you're as ancient as I am and still renting, see estate agents as well, you've got to watch out for. Keep your emails coming in, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, if you've got an Apple iPhone over 5 years old, first of all, congratulations for not having given in to rampant consumerism and adding to the rape of the Earth's rare resources. And also, hat tip for having not dropped it down the loo before trying to rescue it with a bag of rice. I assume it probably takes half a week just to open an app, because it may be what we've suspected all along is true, and Apple have been trying to sabotage your handset with updates to force you to buy a new one. A landmark court case today could see up to 25 million UK owners of iPhone models in the 6s, 7s, 8s and Xs, didn't know there was one, could be automatically awarded damages if they ask. And you've only got 15 minutes before the next ad break to go and rummage through your drawer of doom to check. Well, let's talk now to technology journalist and author Charles Arthur. Charles, what do you make of all of this? I mean, people out there who have always suspected that the circle of death on their phone and how it seems to suddenly slow down, the battery dies, is all a bit of a conspiracy. Are they right?
No, they're wrong. It's an urban legend that Apple puts out a software update that slows down your phone whenever they release a new phone to make you upgrade. It's completely untrue. You can look through Twitter and you'll find that whenever people update their phones, it's just the new software is usually not optimized to run as fast, and you can find exactly the same thing for Android phones. What did happen, though, was that in January 2017, Apple put out an update, iOS 10.2.1. It was a really small update. And what that did was that if you had a phone that at the time was about 3 years old, so an iPhone 6 or more recent, and the battery was getting onto its last legs because perhaps you've been using it very intensively, then if you opened a game or something that demanded peak performance from the iPhone's processor and the battery couldn't handle it, then what would have happened before was the battery just would have died. So you'd be trying to open an app and you'd think you had plenty of juice, but actually the battery would just go and your phone would be dead. What Apple did was that it in this software update, it made it so that the phone software would say, wait a minute, this battery's not in very good condition. I'm going to throttle back. I'm not going to go for the peak performance. I'm just going to go a bit more slowly. It's as if you were in a car and you're trying to reach the next petrol station. You don't have a lot of fuel, so you're not going to go at top speed. You're actually going to go a bit more slowly just to conserve fuel. That was what it did. But it didn't say that it was doing that in the release notes for the software. And it was only sort of 6 months or so after it when people said, wait a minute, this phone is running a bit more slowly, that it actually said, oh yeah, we did put in this thing which will do this throttling. And that has been the cause of all the problems, basically, that it faces here. There was a similar lawsuit to this one. This one is seeking a settlement of, I think, £768 million, which I think is ambitious. There was a settlement in the US arising from a court case that started in 2017, which was settled in 2020, which was about £300 million. That's about $25 per iPhone user for people with those old phones. So, long story short, there may be a case to answer here, but in the general case, there isn't.
So the headlines, 25 million iPhone users could be part of this legal case. Should people be rummaging through their drawers in the hope they might get 25 quid, or should they just let it be?
I think that the standard of proof is going to be difficult. You'll have to show that you were affected by this slowdown, that you were in some way, not only did Apple not tell you about it, but that it did have a material effect. And I think that that might be the tricky thing to prove in court, that this slowdown, that this throttling, this sort of get you to the fuel station without running out, that it had a material effect on your experience. And I suspect that's going to be the crux of this. Not just that Apple didn't tell you that it was doing it, because Apple and Google, when they update the software on people's phones, they do all sorts of things they don't tell you about. They do these behind the scenes. There's lots of security updates, things against viruses and other sorts of attacks, which they don't tell you precisely what they're doing. To that extent, the software is not exactly something in the hands of the user. So I don't think that this is exactly an open goal for the court case, even though other court cases in other countries have succeeded.
Charles Arthur, thank you for explaining all of that to us. Technology journalist there. So there you go. Don't get too excited about earning some cash off your old iPhone. Unlikely to happen. Now, Hollywood actor Kevin Spacey has appeared in court in London this morning after he was charged with allegations of sexual assault. Most of the alleged offences date back more than a decade. Let's go live to Westminster Magistrates Court and get the latest from GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White. Mark.
Good afternoon. Yes, the appearance here of a Hollywood A-lister at a London criminal court was always going to attract huge media interest, and so it was that when Kevin Spacey arrived here, there were dozens of photographers and camera crews and reporters surrounding him as he emerged from his vehicle for the short walk into Westminster Magistrates Court to answer the charges against him. He'd flown across from the United States to hear those charges, 5 counts of sexual assaults against 3 men that date back, most of them, more than a decade. Now, the first allegation centres on an incident that's alleged to have taken place in 2005 involving a man who is now in his 40s, 2 counts of sexual assault. Then the next charges relate to an incident in 2008, again a separate man, 2 incidents, allegations of sexual assault, and then finally 1 count of sexual assault against a 3rd man. That incident, we're told, took place in Gloucestershire in 2013. Now, Kevin Spacey in the dock wearing that pale blue suit that he entered the court with, spoke only to confirm his name, Kevin Spacey, and then his date of birth and also his address here in London. Now, he has been sent on unconditional bail, free from court, to attend again the Southwark Crown Court appearance on the 14th of July. One of the 4 counts against him is an indictable offence, so it can no longer be held or heard in the Magistrates Court. It needs to be elevated to Crown Court, so it will be heard at the Crown Court, Southwark, on the 14th of July. And as I say, Kevin Spacey in the meantime has been released on unconditional bail.
Mark, thank you ever so much. Keep us up to date with the details. That's Mark White, our home and security. Well, good viewers of GB News, having carefully audited the direction of travel in current affairs over the past year, I'm increasingly emboldened that soon I'll be able to co-present with my cat. Not only can I implore the need for a comfort creature, as news is harmful to my mental health, but it seems Mog will have carte blanche access to rented properties. And I'll be protecting the planet by stopping her going out murdering while acting as a deterrent to oiks such as Kurt Zuma from ruining my zen. I just need a nice Blofeld-like sting mocked up and GBNews will be upon us. It's time for the Alex Agenda. Well, Benedict, it's been a busy programme. Alistair, you're still with us today. Any thoughts on some of the stories that we have been discussing?
Oh, I think the Rwanda thing is set to run, isn't it? I mean, this not in the sense of the airplanes having run off the runway, but it's. I do. You know, it was a very interesting thing, wasn't it? To see the numbers of people who were going to be deported and ever sort of going down, down, down. You just sort of knew the second that you had a handful on the plane that it wasn't going to take off. You just sort of had that sense, a bit like watching a football game with Real Madrid playing. You know they're going to score right at the end. It was going to come, and it did. But I do think that as much as people were sort of cheering it on as, this big sort of victory over the government, I actually think it's a massive win for the government because, as we've touched upon with, the start of the programme with the Northern Ireland Protocol and with the reasons for Lord Gate handing in his resignation, potentially, Boris Johnson breaking international law, international organisations, you can sort of sense, whether or not they're related to the European Union, the fight with these international bodies has done so well for Boris Johnson in the past. It's proven a massive vote winner, a massive thing to unite the Tory party on. And I do therefore think it's just going to keep on going, that these are things that are real manna from heaven for a Prime Minister who, a couple of weeks ago, we were saying he was finished. He's never really finished, not when there is a large international organisation to go after and take a few punches at. So I do think that that's something that we just need to keep watching because it's not going anywhere and it'll still be what we're talking about come the next general election.
Benedict, thank you. Alistair, you're still with us. And are you impressed so far by the government's record ever since Partygate, making all the right noises, but are they doing the right things?
I think in a way it's almost like a tale of two governments. You've got this really clever approach, mature approach that looks at the reality that we've got 11 million people stuck in renting. Let's try and fix some of the rules around that. Let's invest more in social housing, is what Michael Gove's been talking about. On the complete other hand, we've got this idea last week that I don't know how much of government outside a few press people knew was coming around extending right to buy in a way that just didn't seem to work. And frankly, when I look at the situation with this Rwanda flight, I think about what's our role in the world in terms of we don't have the routes that we used to have to get refugees to safety in the UK. We don't have legal routes to take the work away from the traffickers. I'd be more interested in our country be a place that can house our people who are already here, who are not facing good housing, and also can be a host to those in need from around the world. And yet we get these two very distinct approaches.
Thanks for sticking around. Great for hearing your opinions. Lovely having you back on the show, Benedict. That's all I have got time for. Tune in, same time, same place, 2 o'clock tomorrow. Now, though, it's time for the weather. Bye-bye.
Hello. For much of England and Wales, the fine weather looks set to continue as we head through the rest of the working week. Plenty of sunshine and probably the peak of the temperatures as we head into Friday. But it will be cooler across Scotland and Northern Ireland with some rain heading in through the course of the day. If we look at the pressure pattern, then you can see high pressure very much dominating across the UK. That's what's brought all the fine weather over the last few days. But it is migrating its way eastwards, and as that happens, we drag in some very warm hot air from the south as we head into Friday. Through the rest of Thursday, then, into the evening and overnight, plenty of cloud across the UK, but most places will be dry with some clear spells. But it's a different story across Scotland and Northern Ireland, with heavier, persistent rain spreading in from the Atlantic as we head through the night. A strengthening breeze here as well, and it won't be a particularly warm night in the north, 12 to 14 degrees, but across England and Wales, another fairly warm, muggy night to come. Temperatures in places not dropping below 17 or 18 degrees Celsius. As we start Friday, then, for most of England and Wales, it's a dry start. Variable amounts of cloud, but that will break to give increasing amounts of sunshine, I think, through the day. Again, a different story for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Here we see outbreaks of rain